Oceanographic Office, and the Naval Observatory all owe their existence in varying degrees to the expedition. Any one of these accomplishments would have been noteworthy. Taken together, they represent a national achievement on the order of the building of the Transcontinental Railroad and the Panama Canal. But if these wonders of technology and human resolve have become part of America's legendary past, the U.S. exploring expedition has been largely forgotten. To understand why, we must look to the expedition's leader. Charles Wilkes was born to well-to-do parents in New York City in 1798. When his mother died just 2 years later, he was placed in the care of an aunt, Elizabeth Ann Seton, who would later convert to Catholicism, become an abbess, and eventually be canonized as America's first native-born saint. Wilkes's exposure to sainthood proved short-lived, however. At just 4 years old, he was sent away to boarding school. When he realized he was about to be abandoned at the school, Wilkes clung to his father's leg and refused to let go. "Young as I was," he wrote, "the impression is still on me, and it is the first event of my life that I have any distinct recollection of." For the next 10 years, Wilkes was, in his own words, a poor castaway boy, attending a series of boarding schools that he hated, always yearning to be at home with the father he loved. "I had no other companions than my books and teachers," he remembered. But there was always the sea. Manhattan was surrounded by water, and hull to hull along the waterfront was a restless wooden exoskeleton of ships, their long bowsprits nuzzling over the busy streets, the eyes of even the most jaundiced New Yorker irresistibly drawn skyward into a complex forest of spars and rigging. This was where a boy might turn his back on all that he had once known and step into an exotic dream of adventure, freedom, opportunity, and risk. When Wilkes was 16 years old, he began to press his father to apply for a midshipman's warrant. Under usual circumstances, the Wilkes family had all the social and political connections required to secure such an appointment. Wilkes's mother had been the daughter of William Seton, a wealthy New York merchant. His father was the grandson of an even wealthier British distiller. His father's uncle, John Wilkes, a member of Parliament, had gained international fame for his outspoken support of the American cause during the Revolution. Wilkes's own father, whose middle name was de Pontieu, had aristocratic relatives in Paris with close ties to the French Navy. But in 1815, not even this impressive pedigree could guarantee a midshipman's appointment. With the end of the War of 1812, the Navy found itself overloaded with officers. Prospects of peace meant that the number of naval vessels would only decrease. The young Wilkes was receiving little help from his father, who wanted him to become a businessman like himself. By this time, Wilkes was enrolled as a day student at a preparatory school for Columbia College and was showing remarkable promise in mathematics and languages. But no matter how much his father attempted to convince his son that he should stay ashore, dangling before him the prospect of a promising job with his uncle at the Bank of New York, Wilkes's hankering after naval life and roving life still grew stronger and stronger. Wilkes began studying with Jonathan Garnett, the editor of the American Nautical Almanac. Garnett familiarized the boy with the various mathematical formulae, tables, and solutions associated with navigation. He taught him how to read nautical charts and how to use navigational instruments. He even gave Wilkes his own sextant, which the boy learned how to take apart and put back together. "Before I put my foot on the deck of a vessel," he wrote, "I felt capable of navigating and directing her course." Thus was born an attitude toward the sea that Wilkes would subscribe to in the years ahead. Book learning, at least his version of book learning, was more than a match for anyone else's practical experience. Failing to secure an outright commission, Wilkes made an application for a midshipman's warrant contingent on his first gaining relevant sea experience in the merchant marine. Reluctantly, Wilkes's father agreed to let him go, hopeful that the contrast between New York society and the forecastle of a merchant vessel would bring the boy to his senses. Just a few days into his first voyage aboard the Hibernia, one of hundreds of vessels carrying goods and passengers between America and Europe, Wilkes understood why his father had been so hesitant. A more ignorant and brutal set of fellows could scarcely have been collected together, he remembered. His hands were continually bleeding. His bowels were reacting cataclysmically to the harsh shipboard fare, and even worse, the jacket and trousers he had taken such pride in were smeared with tar. "Could I have set my foot on shore," he wrote, "I never would have again consented to be again afloat." Despite his suffering, Wilkes could not help but be fascinated by the spectacle of a fully rigged ship under sail. "I had from my reading become acquainted with many of the maneuvers," he wrote, "and took great delight in watching how things were done practically." The captain heard that Wilkes knew how to perform a lunar, a complicated series of observations to determine a ship's longitude that required as many as 3 hours of calculations and was beyond the abilities of many captains in the merchant service. "Although I had little practice at sea," Wilkes wrote, "I readily came to take good and satisfactory observations." The captain then proceeded to take credit for the young man's abilities, assuring the paying passengers that he would, in Wilkes's words, "make me a good navigator." Wilkes was infuriated by the captain's deception, but his time would come. Not long into the voyage, the captain revealed to Wilkes that, incredibly, he had forgotten to bring his charts. He asked the boy if he might be able to draw a chart of the English Channel from memory. Revealing an early willingness to take on a seemingly hopeless task, Wilkes agreed to give it a try. "The next day I was called into the cabin and sheets of letter paper handed me." He hurriedly sketched out a fairly detailed representation of the English Channel, and stunningly, with Wilkes's map in hand, the captain was able to guide the Hibernia to Le Havre, France, without incident. Not until 3 years later, after several more merchant voyages, did Wilkes finally receive his appointment in the Navy as a midshipman, primarily through the intervention of his father's friend, Monsieur Hyde de Neuville, the French minister. After a brief visit to Washington, D.C., to thank de Neuville for his help, Wilkes returned to New York to discover that his father had died. "I never saw him after I entered the Navy," Wilkes wrote, adding, "I shall not attempt to describe the feelings I experienced, and the desolation which home seemed to have undergone." In 1821, 23-year-old Wilkes began seeing a woman he had known since he was a child. Jane Renwick, though not handsome, according to Wilkes, showed great intelligence, and was ever open to administer to the wants of others. The Renwicks had been close family friends of the Wilkeses, and there had been many times when growing up that young Charles had come to blows with Jane's brother James over his unmerciful teasing of his sister. For Wilkes, Jane Renwick was the love of his life. The evenings Wilkes spent over the next months with Jane and her mother turned out to be some of the happiest times he had ever known. "We had a never-ending source of amusement," Wilkes remembered. "I often read aloud, and while they read, I drew, and the hilarity and fun was charming." When he received orders to report to the Franklin for a cruise to the Pacific, Wilkes found it hard indeed for me to return to duty, and at the same time forego all the delights of the society of those I was deeply in love with. The Franklin proved to be just the ship for an officer of Wilkes's interests. On the gun deck there was a library, and Wilkes, with the help of an assistant, became the librarian. But perhaps the best part of the cruise was its destination, the newly established Pacific station along the west coast of South America. Wilkes was about to encounter the ocean he had been dreaming about since he was a young boy. With the 3 voyages of James Cook, Great Britain had set the pattern for future global exploration. 2 sturdy and seaworthy ships led by a captain with extensive surveying experience. By 1804, the exploratory efforts of the world's leading maritime power were coordinated by one man, John Barrow, the second Secretary of the Admiralty. Safely ensconced in his office at Whitehall, where he remained insulated from the disruptions of political change, Barrow was free to send out a seemingly continuous stream of wondrously equipped expeditions. Except for a brief hiatus in 1806 to 1807, Barrow would remain at the Admiralty for the next 44 years, and over that span of time he would dispatch voyages to just about every corner of the world in a deliberate campaign to extend the bounds of British scientific knowledge and influence.